Hey guys, this is Zyloc with Media Hindsight, and I'm here to take you on a trip through the past, one game at a time. And today, we're going to look at Turrican for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive systems. The game exists on a lot of different platforms, the NES, the Amiga, the TurboGrafx 16, and somehow they even ported it over to the original Game Boy, which is fascinating. I'd actually really like to give that one a shot. I got introduced into the series. I played Super Turrican for the Super Nintendo first, and that game blew my mind. As far as I'm concerned, it's just as good as greats like Contra 3, and then after that, I played Mega Turrican for the Sega Genesis, which is also amazing. Maybe not quite as good as Super Turrican, but it's definitely up there. And when I found Turrican in the wild, I think I found it in a flea market or something. It was pretty cheap, but I found cartridge, box, and instruction manual, which is pretty rare, and they're in okay condition, but I had to give it a shot. I wanted to see where the series originated from and kind of get an idea of how the series progressed. So let's take a look. Turrican's gameplay is an interesting mashup of Metroid and Contra blended into a much less polished experience, but one that feels new and interesting all at the same time. There are 5 sprawling levels to explore in Turrican, each having very distinct looks, almost as if they were their own planets, but much like Metroid, each area is just a separate zone of the same world. The difference here is that each level is separate, and you won't be returning to any of them along your journey, so the experience is more linear in that regard. But the levels are so large, both in length and in verticality, that you will find yourself spending a fair amount of time in each, searching out hidden areas. Finding these areas will greatly benefit you, as they often contain several extra lives, which really are the most important resource in this game. But for all of the exploration that is encouraged, why there needs to be a timer to each level is beyond me. If this timer runs out, you lose a life, and the clock is reset. The sense of urgency is kind of nice, but when you're promoting a sense of exploration as well, you don't really need this, as the game's difficulty already imposes, that kind of urgency upon the player. So this timer isn't required. As you progress through each level, blasting aliens and rogue machines, you will happen upon weapon power-ups, ammo, and extra lives. For each weapon power-up that you collect, your gun will be upgraded to either a laser rifle or a spread shot. The spread shot was my weapon of choice almost exclusively throughout my time with the game, as the laser rifle, while powerful, just wasn't able to destroy the many fast-moving enemies that inhabit this world. This is where the comparison to the Contra series begins and ends, though, as I would have preferred a few more gun options, and the controls and action just don't feel as smooth or exciting. On top of these limited options, you also have access to an electric whip. Just imagine the proton pack from the Ghostbusters and you'll have a good idea. And you can use this as long as you are standing still and holding down the fire button. The whip can be spun around the player 360 degrees and will vaporize any enemy it comes into contact with. Very powerful, but the player really has to strategize before busting all those aliens. You have access to a few limited use weapons, grenades, power lines, and mines as well. You get 3 of each per life, but you can pick up more along the way, and are used to eliminate several enemies at once, in different ways. Lastly, you have the ability to turn into a buzzsaw that can roll around the ground, much like Samus's Morph Ball from Metroid, but there are a few key differences here. First of all, you're completely invulnerable while in this state, and destroy any enemy you touch in a single blow, aside from bosses. You can assume this form indefinitely, and it might seem overpowered at first until you realize that you can't jump over obstacles, and due to this game's heavy emphasis on platforming and exploration, you won't be cruising through levels like Sonic the Hedgehog on this adventure for long. Take into account that this form can only be activated 3 times per life, and you will quickly realize it needs to be saved for emergencies. My time spent with Turrican had 2 very distinct phases. My first opinion was, why is this game so damn hard? How is it fair that I don't have enough time to react to enemies falling from the sky or zipping toward me at breakneck speed off the side of the screen? While playing, you're going to get blindsided by enemies around every corner. Most games give you a second or two heads up to think about your options, but in Turrican, You must quickly learn from your deaths and assume the worst based on the terrain beforehand. You have a life bar that allows you to take 5 to 10 hits, which is nice, but here's where one big problem lies. Most games, when you get hit by an enemy, provide you a second or two of invincibility to react and get out of harm's way. This gives you the time to learn, but most importantly, adapt on the fly. On this alien world, if the enemy is touching you, you are taking constant damage, and quickly. Sometimes an enemy will drop from a platform above you, and before you can even jump or even see it, your life bar is completely drained. This is a cheap death in my book, and my biggest fault with Turrican overall. Lives are precious commodities, and when you can lose them so quickly due to one mistake or inexperience with the next part of the level, they become even that much more precious. Good thing that when you die, you restart where you kicked the bucket with all the enemies banished around you. Another strange design choice is that of the power-ups that float around each level. Most games this is a pretty jovial sight, but in Turrican, why are they covered in spikes and able to harm the player too? It doesn't make any sense, and when there's a large amount of them in one area, they're almost more dangerous than the surrounding enemies. We players certainly don't need more to worry about in this game. My last big gripe is with the bosses. While there are a few bosses per level, they all typically follow one of two formulas. They're either a hovering enemy that attempts to squash you as it chases you about its chamber, or a screen-filling creature that simply moves back and forth across the screen, occasionally launching a projectile your way. Both of these are fairly boring, and the diversity is terrible, and what's worse is the first and last boss have the exact same attack pattern, minus a couple laser beams. The bosses don't require a ton of firepower to eliminate, but how is it fair that they are so large and your character doesn't have the mobility to dodge them? If they touch you once, which they will, you're either dead or on a sliver of life support. These bosses are not well designed, not fun to fight, and didn't leave me feeling accomplished in the least. It was more a matter of how fast I could spam my special weapons before they drained me of each and every extra life I had, than a matter of skill. But I want to be clear about something. Somewhere about halfway through the game, something clicked for me. This wasn't a sense of frustration and defeat, but more an epiphany that I finally understood why I had this particular set of tools at my disposal and what I needed to do and be more careful about. I'm not saying Turrican teaches the player in the right way, but eventually the formula of the gameplay becomes more second nature, and you learn that when you think there is something tricky or unfair around the corner, that there probably is. But in knowing this, you have the right weapon prepared to help counteract it. It's hard to explain, but it felt good and finally allowed me to really enjoy Turrican for what it is. A hectic, masochistic, non-linear platforming action game that pulls the player in and makes you play by its rules until you learn the skills to break them. The levels in Turrican all look fairly unique, and this is a good thing, because my extended stay in each level left me pining for a change of scenery and color palette. The levels don't look inherently bad, but the same enemies and assets are used just a few too many times, and it feels like the designers were maybe spending too much time on the size of the levels and not enough on the attention to detail that would make the exploration more rewarding for the player. Level 3, the space station, did stand out to me though, as it cut up the levels into several different parts that not only change up the gameplay, but also the aesthetics of the different sectors you were exploring. And I really wish that other levels would have kind of followed this formula as well. The sound effects in Turrican are very well done. Each weapon sounds powerful and each enemy explodes with various effects. When you land from a jump though, your character always makes this kind of odd thud sound. Well, I think there should be a sound for this. Why is it that it's so noticeable and loud? If this sound was simply muffled, the sound effects would be about perfect. The music accompanying each stage isn't very memorable or catchy. It's more just there to set a sort of perilous mood, but it takes a back seat to the sound of battle in both quality and volume. Initially, I was going to give this game a much lower score than I did, because I really needed to put it down to save my patience at one point. Which initially is a shame for me because I'm such a huge fan of the series, but I'm glad I really stuck with it though, as it provided me with not only a surprising twist on the traditional run-and-gun side-scroller, but also to strategic resource use. And for all these reasons, I need to give Turrican a 75 out of 100. You could almost consider this one of the first survival horror games to a certain extent, an early Dead Space if you will. I recommend anyone bored of playing through Contra Hard Corps or Super Metroid, although I'm not really sure how that's possible, to give Turrican and its sequels a shot. I believe you'll find a solid twist on these formulas, but don't go in expecting the same polish with Turrican for the Sega Genesis.